Why?
They say the first few years of marriage are the honeymoon period, a time when everything feels effortless and magical. For me and Lauren, it seemed that period never ended. 8 years in, and I still looked at her with the same awe I had the day we met. Lauren was everything I'd ever wanted. Intelligent, kind, funny, and stunningly beautiful. We had built a life together that, to everyone around us, seemed perfect. A charming house in the suburbs, weekend getaways, and the kind of laughter that echoed through our home and made it feel alive. But perfection, I've learned, is often an illusion. I met Lauren at a charity event hosted by a mutual friend. She was wearing a deep green dress that brought out her hazel eyes, and when she laughed, it was like the world had tilted slightly to make her the center of it. I'd approached her with a mix of confidence and nerves, fully prepared to be brushed off by someone so effortlessly captivating. But to my surprise, she was warm and down to earth, her wit sharp but inviting. We spent the evening talking, and by the end of it I was completely smitten. Our courtship was swift but meaningful. Within a year, we were engaged, and 6 months after that, we were married in a small ceremony surrounded by family and close friends. Everything about Lauren felt right. She brought balance to my life, grounding me when work stresses became overwhelming and encouraging me to chase my dreams. In return, I did everything I could to make her happy, to show her how much I cherished her. The first few years of our marriage were idyllic. We traveled whenever we could, exploring cities and savoring the freedom of being young and untethered. Lauren's career as a marketing consultant flourished, and she seemed to thrive on the challenges it brought. I'd often find her in our home office late at night, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked on a campaign. I'd bring her a cup of tea and sit with her, marveling at her dedication and the way her mind worked. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. We'd host dinner parties for friends, spend lazy Sundays binge-watching shows, and talk late into the night about everything and nothing. Our friends often commented on how in sync we seemed, how lucky we were to have found each other. And I believed it too. Lauren was my partner, my confidant, my everything. But cracks have a way of forming in even the most solid structures, often so subtly that you don't notice them until it's too late. Looking back, I can pinpoint the first signs of change to about a year ago. Lauren started coming home later than usual, her explanations vague but reasonable. Work had always been demanding, so I didn't think much of it. She'd tell me about client meetings running late or last-minute deadlines, and I'd nod, offering to heat up dinner for her when she got home. At first, these late nights were occasional, but they gradually became more frequent. Lauren would walk through the door looking tired, her smile less vibrant than it used to be. She'd kiss me on the cheek and head straight to the shower, claiming she needed to wash off the day. I chalked it up to stress, convincing myself that her job was simply taking a toll on her. After all, she'd always been passionate about her work, pouring her heart into every project. But then there were the smaller things, the ones that didn't quite add up. Lauren had always been open with her phone, often leaving it on the counter or couch without a second thought. Now it was always with her, either in her hand or tucked away in her bag. She'd glance at it frequently, her expression unreadable, and if I asked who she was texting, she'd smile and say it was work-related. Her answers were casual, but there was a new guardedness in her tone that made me uneasy. One evening, I noticed a faint scent of cologne on her jacket as she draped it over the chair. It wasn't a fragrance I recognized, and when I mentioned it, she laughed it off, saying it must have been from a colleague who'd leaned in too close during a conversation. Her explanation seemed plausible, but something about the way she dismissed it left me unsettled. It was the first time I felt a flicker of doubt, a small crack in the trust that had always been the foundation of our relationship. As the weeks went on, these moments became harder to ignore. Lauren's stories didn't always line up, and her laughter felt more strained, less genuine. She started spending weekends away, claiming she needed time to herself or to visit friends. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, to believe that there was nothing more to her behavior than what she'd told me. But the voice in the back of my mind grew louder, whispering that something wasn't right. I tried to push the doubts aside, focusing instead on the parts of our relationship that still felt familiar. We still had our routines, our shared jokes, and the quiet moments that made life with her so special. But the unease lingered, like a shadow that refused to be banished. I found myself analyzing her every word, her every action, searching for clues that might confirm or dispel my suspicions. The tipping point came one evening when Lauren said she'd be working late again. As I sat alone at the dinner table, her plate untouched across from me, I felt a wave of frustration and loneliness wash over me. I glanced at my phone, scrolling through photos of us from happier times. There we were, laughing on a beach, toasting glasses of champagne at a friend's wedding, cuddled up on the couch with our dog. The memories felt like a cruel reminder of what I feared was slipping away. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and replaying every odd moment from the past few months. The cologne, the late nights, the phone glued to her side. Each piece felt like part of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I needed to trust her, to give her the space she'd always given me. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong. I just didn't know how to face it. In the days that followed, I began paying closer attention to Lauren's behavior. I started noticing patterns. The way she'd check her phone more often when she thought I wasn't looking. The way her excuses for being late grew more rehearsed. One afternoon, while she was in the shower, I saw a text notification flash across her screen. It was from someone named E. The message was brief, just a simple "can't wait to see you." But it was enough to make my stomach churn. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I decided to wait to gather more information before jumping to conclusions. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, that my fears were unfounded. But the more I observed, the harder it became to hold onto that hope. Our friends still saw us as the perfect couple, their compliments on our relationship feeling like salt in an open wound. I didn't know how to tell them, how to admit that the life Lauren and I had built might not be as solid as it seemed. For now, I kept the doubts to myself, wearing the mask of a loving husband while my mind raced with questions I didn't yet have the courage to ask. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between Lauren and me grew. She seemed to retreat further into herself, her laughter and warmth replaced by a quiet detachment. I wanted to reach out to pull her back to me, but I didn't know how. The woman I'd fallen in love with felt like a stranger, and I was left wondering if I'd ever really known her at all. Suspicion has a way of eating at you, taking root in the quiet corners of your mind and growing into something you can't ignore. After that afternoon with the text from E, it became impossible to silence the questions swirling in my head. Lauren continued to act like everything was normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit, no matter how hard I tried to force them together. The days felt longer, and the nights even more so. I'd lie awake, listening to Lauren's steady breathing beside me, wondering if she was dreaming about someone else. It was a cruel thought, one I hated myself for having, but it felt unavoidable. Every interaction with her became a test, a search for clues hidden in her words or her expressions. I wanted so desperately to believe her, to trust that we were just going through a rough patch. But trust, I was learning, is a fragile thing. Once it's cracked, every glance, every silence feels like another blow, widening the fissure until it threatens to break entirely. One evening, Lauren announced that she'd be going out with friends from work. She seemed excited, her mood lighter than it had been in weeks. She picked out a dress I hadn't seen her wear in a long time, one that clung to her in a way that made my stomach twist with a mix of admiration and unease. As she put on her makeup, I asked her who she'd be meeting, trying to keep my tone casual. She rattled off a few names, none of which stood out to me, and assured me she'd be home by midnight. I sat on the couch after she left, staring at the TV without really watching. The idea of following her crossed my mind, but I dismissed it almost immediately. What kind of husband spies on his wife? The thought felt wrong, invasive, but the longer I sat there, the heavier the idea became, like a stone in my chest. By the time I grabbed my keys, I'd convinced myself it wasn't about spying. It was about finding answers. I stayed a safe distance behind her car as she drove, my heart pounding with every turn she took. She wasn't heading toward any of the restaurants or bars she'd mentioned before. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel on the other side of town. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I watched her get out of the car, her phone pressed to her ear. She laughed at something the person on the other end said, a sound that felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Then she disappeared through the hotel's sliding doors. I didn't follow her inside. Sitting in my car, I felt like I was drowning in a sea of possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe she was meeting a client or a friend who happened to be staying there. But the way she dressed, the way she'd laughed, it didn't feel innocent. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring at the hotel entrance and willing her to reappear. When she finally did, she wasn't alone. A man walked out with her, his hand resting lightly on her lower back. He was tall, well-dressed, and unfamiliar. They spoke for a moment before she hugged him, her arms lingering around his neck longer than necessary. He walked her to her car, and as she got in, he leaned down and said something that made her smile. I couldn't hear the words, but the look on her face said enough. It was a look I'd once believed was meant only for me. I drove home in a haze, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, hurt, and confusion. By the time Lauren returned, I was sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey and an empty glass in front of me. She breezed in with a cheerful "Hi, honey," and kissed me on the cheek before heading to the bedroom. I didn't say anything, didn't trust myself to speak without letting the storm inside me spill out. The next day, I resolved to confront her, but when the moment came, I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if I'd misread the situation? Let my paranoia twist something innocent into something sinister. The thought of accusing her and being wrong felt almost as unbearable as the thought of her betrayal. So instead, I decided to wait, to gather more evidence before making my move. I started paying closer attention to her phone. Whenever she left it unattended, I'd glance at the screen, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that would confirm or dispel my fears. One afternoon, while she was in the shower, I finally found what I was looking for. A message from E popped up, and I couldn't resist opening it. The conversation was brief but intimate, filled with inside jokes and references to moments I hadn't been a part of. One message stood out. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. I closed the phone and sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. There was no misinterpreting that message. Whatever hope I'd been holding onto was gone, replaced by a cold, numbing certainty. Lauren was having an affair. The woman I'd built my life with, the person I'd trusted more than anyone, was sharing parts of herself with someone else. That night I didn't sleep. I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling and wondering how we'd gotten here. Was it something I'd done? Something I hadn't done? The questions were endless, each one cutting deeper than the last. I wanted to wake her up, to demand answers, to force her to tell me why. But instead, I stayed silent, unsure of what I'd say if she turned the question back on me. Over the next few days, I tried to act normal, though every interaction with Lauren felt like a performance. I'd smile when she smiled, laugh when she laughed, all the while feeling like I was watching us from the outside. Inside, I was unraveling, torn between the need for answers and the fear of what those answers might be. The breaking point came when Lauren announced another late night at work. This time, I didn't follow her. Instead, I stayed home, scrolling through her social media and piecing together the parts of her life she hadn't shared with me. There were photos I didn't recognize, places she'd been that she hadn't mentioned. And then there were the comments from E, subtle but telling. Can't wait for our next adventure. One read, beneath a picture of Lauren at a restaurant I'd never been to. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I began making plans. If Lauren was living a double life, I needed to know the full extent of it. I couldn't let her lies dictate my reality any longer. It was time to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The truth was like a splinter lodged deep beneath my skin. Small, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore. Every interaction with Lauren felt tainted now. Every smile and laugh overshadowed by the knowledge of her betrayal. But if she sensed that I knew, she didn't show it. She moved through our days together with the same practiced ease. Her charm a mask so convincing that it almost made me question myself. Almost. I couldn't live in limbo anymore, trapped between the life I thought we had and the reality of her deception. I needed closure, not just for the affair but for the nagging feeling that there was more to the story than I had uncovered. So I decided to dig deeper. If Lauren had secrets, I was going to find them. My first step was to track her movements. I hated the idea of spying on her, but I convinced myself it was necessary. She'd lied to me about where she'd been, about who she'd been with, and I couldn't take her word for anything anymore. I purchased a GPS tracker online, a small, discreet device that I attached to her car late one night while she was asleep. It was a desperate move, one that made me feel both ashamed and resolute. The tracker sent updates to my phone, allowing me to see exactly where she went when she said she was working late or meeting friends. The first few days yielded nothing unusual. Her routes were predictable, her destinations familiar. But on the third day something changed. She left work at her usual time but didn't head home. Instead, she drove to a part of town we rarely visited, parking outside a townhouse I didn't recognize. She stayed there for nearly 2 hours before heading home. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I decided to see if this pattern would repeat. Over the next week, it did, always the same townhouse, always for hours at a time. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever lived there was connected to E, the person she'd been texting. The thought made my stomach churn, but it also strengthened my resolve. If she was going to keep lying, I needed undeniable proof of the truth. One evening, I followed her to the townhouse. I parked a safe distance away, watching as she entered through the front door without knocking. The lights inside flickered on, shadows moving behind the curtains. I stayed in my car, my mind racing with possibilities. Who was this person? What were they to her? The questions buzzed in my head, each one more painful than the last. I didn't have to wait long for an answer. About an hour later, the door opened, and Lauren stepped outside, followed by a man. He was tall, with dark hair and a confident posture that made my blood boil. They stood close, their body language intimate in a way that left no room for doubt. When he leaned down to kiss her, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I'd seen enough. My heart felt like it was breaking all over again, the pieces shattering further with every moment I sat there. I waited until they went back inside before driving away, my mind numb and my chest aching. That night I didn't go home. I couldn't face her, not after what I'd seen. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, staring at the cracked ceiling as I tried to process everything. The next morning I made a decision. If Lauren was willing to risk everything we'd built for this man, then I needed to know who he was. I used the license plate of the car parked outside the townhouse to look him up, a task that was easier than I expected. His name was Eric, and a quick search revealed more than I'd anticipated. He wasn't just some random guy. He was connected to Lauren's company. Specifically, he was a client she'd been working with for months. The revelation added another layer to the betrayal. This wasn't just personal, it was professional. She'd brought him into our lives under the guise of work, using their supposed projects as a cover for their affair. The thought made me sick, but it also gave me a sense of clarity. I wasn't dealing with a fleeting mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was calculated, deliberate, and ongoing. I decided to confront her that evening. I rehearsed what I would say, imagining every possible response she might give. I wanted to be calm, collected, to show her that I wasn't going to let her lies control me any longer. But when the moment came, my emotions got the better of me. Lauren was in the kitchen when I walked in, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up and smiled, the sight of her so normal and familiar that it almost stopped me in my tracks. Almost. I took a deep breath and told her that I knew about Eric, about the townhouse, about the lies. Her expression froze, the knife in her hand hovering midair. What happened next wasn't what I expected. I thought she'd deny it, try to gaslight me into believing I was wrong. But instead, she sighed and set the knife down, her shoulders slumping as though a weight had been lifted. She admitted to the affair, her voice calm and almost resigned. She said it had started months ago, that she hadn't planned for it to happen but hadn't been able to stop it once it did. She didn't apologize, not at first. Instead, she talked about feeling disconnected, about how my suspicions and distance had made her feel even more alone. It was a deflection, an attempt to share the blame for something that was entirely her choice. I listened in silence, my anger simmering beneath the surface as she laid out her justifications. When she finally asked if I could forgive her, I didn't answer. I told her I needed time, that I couldn't make a decision about our future in the heat of the moment. She nodded, her eyes glassy with tears she didn't let fall. For the first time in months, her mask had slipped, and I saw her for who she really was, flawed, selfish, and undeniably human. That night, I slept in the guest room, the distance between us both physical and emotional. I knew our marriage would never be the same, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to let it go. Part of me still loved her, still clung to the memories of the life we'd shared. But another part of me, the part that had seen her kiss another man, knew that some wounds couldn't be healed. In the days that followed, Lauren made an effort to repair the damage. She ended things with Eric, deleting his number and blocking him on all platforms. She offered to go to therapy, to do whatever it took to earn back my trust. But for all her promises, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that she was still holding something back. And until I knew the full truth, I couldn't move forward, with her or without her. The days that followed my confrontation with Lauren were an emotional minefield. On the surface, it seemed like we were taking steps toward mending what had been broken. She kept her phone out in the open, and the late nights stopped entirely. She initiated conversations about us, about our future, speaking with a sincerity that made me want to believe her. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension simmered, a chasm that no amount of effort seemed to bridge. I found myself obsessing over the details of her affair, replaying the images of her and Eric together in my mind. Despite her assurances that she had cut all ties with him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Every time her phone buzzed or she left the room to take a call, my heart raced, even if she returned moments later with a mundane explanation. The trust we'd built over years of marriage was gone, replaced by a gnawing doubt that refused to let me rest. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office and volunteering for extra projects. The distraction helped, but only briefly. Nights at home were the hardest. Lauren and I would sit together on the couch, the TV on as a buffer against the silence. She'd reach for my hand, and I'd let her, but the gesture felt hollow. The intimacy we'd once shared had been replaced by a strained politeness, as though we were playing roles in a script neither of us believed in anymore. It was during one of these nights, as I sat scrolling through emails on my laptop, that I stumbled across something that reignited my suspicions. An email from Eric, or rather, an email thread that Lauren had forwarded to herself months ago. The subject line was innocuous, "Project Notes." But as I clicked through the thread, I realized it wasn't about work at all. The messages were casual, filled with inside jokes and references to shared moments that had nothing to do with their professional relationship. One line, in particular, caught my attention. "We need to be more careful. Last time was too close." My blood ran cold as I stared at the words, the implications swirling in my mind. Lauren had said the affair was over, that she had ended it as soon as I confronted her. But this email thread told a different story, one where their connection had been ongoing for much longer than I'd realized. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I forwarded the emails to my personal account and deleted the evidence of my snooping. I needed time to process what I'd found, to decide what my next move would be. Part of me wanted to believe that these emails were old, remnants of a chapter she had truly closed. But another part, the part that had been burned by her lies before, refused to take her at her word. Over the next few days, I started digging deeper. I combed through her laptop and phone whenever the opportunity presented itself, looking for anything that might confirm or disprove my suspicions. It didn't take long to find more. Hidden in a folder labeled Invoices was a series of text exchanges between Lauren and Eric. The messages were damning, filled with plans to meet and coded language that made my stomach churn. But there was something else in those messages, something that took me by surprise. They weren't just talking about their relationship. They were discussing me. My schedule, my habits, even my financial accounts. It was all there, laid out in stark detail. It became clear that their connection went beyond an affair. This wasn't just a betrayal of love. It was a betrayal of trust on a level I hadn't even considered. The realization hit me like a freight train. They were planning something. Something bigger than their affair. Something that involved me in ways I couldn't yet fully understand. The pieces began to click into place. Lauren's sudden interest in managing our finances, her insistence on setting up a joint account for convenience, and the unexplained charges I'd noticed on our credit card over the past few months. It all pointed to one thing. I was being set up. I felt a surge of anger, hotter and more focused than anything I'd felt before. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about my livelihood, my future. I couldn't sit idly by while they schemed behind my back. If they thought I was going to roll over and let them take advantage of me, they were sorely mistaken. I began formulating a plan. The first step was to gather as much evidence as possible. I copied every incriminating message, every questionable transaction, and every piece of correspondence that hinted at their intentions. I organized it into folders, labeling each one clearly so there would be no room for ambiguity. If this came to a legal battle, I wanted to be ready. The next step was to confront Eric. I'd avoided him up until now, content to let my anger simmer in the background. But if I was going to get to the bottom of this, I needed answers. I found his address through a background check and decided to pay him a visit. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that confronting him directly would give me the clarity I needed. When I arrived at his townhouse, my heart was pounding in my chest. I rang the doorbell, and after a few moments he answered. He looked surprised to see me but recovered quickly, a smug smile spreading across his face. He invited me in, his tone casual, as though we were old friends catching up. The audacity of it made my blood boil. The conversation was tense, each of us circling the other like predators sizing up their prey. I asked him about the emails, the texts, the plans he and Lauren had been making. At first, he played dumb, feigning innocence with a charm that only made me angrier. But as I pressed him, his facade began to crack. He admitted to the affair, shrugging it off as though it were a minor indiscretion. But when I brought up their plans to target me, his demeanor shifted. He didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and smirked, his confidence unshaken. He told me I couldn't prove anything, that no one would believe me over them. His arrogance was infuriating, but it also gave me exactly what I needed. Every word he said only strengthened my resolve to expose him and Lauren for who they really were. I left his townhouse that evening with a newfound determination. This wasn't just about salvaging my marriage or protecting my assets. This was about reclaiming control over my life, about refusing to let them dictate my future. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going down without a fight. The days that followed my meeting with Eric were a blur of planning and quiet determination. His smugness had only solidified my resolve. He thought he had outmaneuvered me, that his web of lies and manipulation was unbreakable. But he had underestimated me. I wasn't going to sit back and let them destroy my life. This was my chance to take control, to expose their deceit and ensure they paid for what they had done. I spent hours combing through the evidence I had collected, organizing it into a comprehensive timeline. Emails, texts, financial records, and even the recording of my conversation with Eric. It was all meticulously cataloged. I consulted my lawyer again, sharing the new information and discussing my options. He was impressed by the thoroughness of my documentation and assured me that I had a strong case. His advice was clear. Gather as much evidence as possible and stay composed. The truth would speak for itself. I decided the best way to confront Lauren was to do it publicly. She had spent months crafting a narrative, presenting herself as the perfect wife while betraying me behind closed doors. I wanted her duplicity laid bare, not just for my sake, but to ensure she couldn't manipulate her way out of the situation. I planned a family dinner at our home, inviting close relatives and a few trusted friends. It was the perfect setting, intimate yet formal enough to command attention. The evening of the dinner, I felt a strange mix of nerves and calm. Lauren had no idea what was coming. She moved through the preparations with an air of casual confidence, chatting with guests and laughing at their jokes. Watching her was surreal, like observing a stranger wearing my wife's face. I wondered if she had always been this good at pretending, or if the deception had sharpened her skills. When everyone was seated, I stood at the head of the table and cleared my throat. The room quieted, all eyes turning to me. I began by thanking everyone for coming, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Then, without preamble, I started recounting the events of the past few months. I spoke about the late nights, the unexplained absences, and the growing distance in my marriage. As I laid out the facts, I could see confusion flicker across Lauren's face, quickly replaced by a carefully neutral expression. I continued, detailing the affair with Eric and their plans to target me. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room as I presented the evidence. Printed emails, screenshots of text messages, and financial discrepancies that painted a clear picture of their scheme. Lauren's composure began to crack. She tried to interject, to deny or explain, but the weight of the evidence silenced her. By the time I played the recording of my conversation with Eric, the room was utterly silent. When I finished, I looked directly at Lauren. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of saying something, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But then her shoulders slumped, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. The realization hit her as hard as it had hit me weeks ago. There was no escaping the truth. The aftermath of that dinner was messy and emotional. Lauren's parents, who had always adored me, were devastated. Her friends, the ones who had been complicit in covering for her, avoided my eyes, their guilt written across their faces. Eric's name became a whispered curse among the guests, his absence only fueling their outrage. I stayed calm throughout, answering questions and reiterating that my goal wasn't to destroy Lauren, but to protect myself and move forward. Lauren moved out of the house the next day. She left behind a note, a rambling apology that felt more like an attempt to absolve herself than a genuine expression of remorse. I read it once before tucking it away in a drawer, unsure if I'd ever want to revisit those words. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. With Lauren gone, the house felt both emptier and lighter. The reminders of our life together were everywhere. The photos on the walls, the souvenirs from trips we'd taken, the little touches of her personality that lingered in every room. I spent days packing away her belongings, sorting through the memories with a mix of sadness and relief. It was a painful process, but it felt necessary. Each box I sealed was another step toward reclaiming my space and my sense of self. Eric didn't escape unscathed either. Armed with the evidence I had collected, I filed a formal complaint with his company, exposing his unprofessional conduct and his involvement in the scheme. The fallout was swift. He was terminated within days, his reputation in shambles. I took no pleasure in his downfall, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing he wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else the way he had hurt me. As the weeks turned into months, I focused on rebuilding. Therapy became a cornerstone of my recovery, giving me the tools to process my emotions and work through the lingering doubts and insecurities. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from, finding solace in their support and understanding. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again. One day, while cleaning out the guest room, I stumbled across the photo album Lauren had made for our first anniversary. Flipping through the pages, I felt a pang of sadness for the life we'd once shared, the dreams we'd had for our future. But as I closed the album and placed it in a box, I realized that those memories didn't define me. They were a part of my story, yes, but not the whole of it. The final twist in the tale came months later, when I received an unexpected message from one of Lauren's former friends. She apologized for her complicity in the affair, explaining that she'd felt pressured to stay silent. But what struck me most was her revelation that Lauren hadn't been the mastermind behind the scheme. According to her, Eric had manipulated Lauren, using her insecurities and fears to draw her into his plan. Lauren had been a willing participant, yes, but she had also been a victim in her own way. The news left me conflicted. It didn't absolve Lauren of her actions, but it added nuance to the narrative I'd constructed in my mind. For the first time, I felt a flicker of empathy for her, a recognition of the complexities that had led us to this point. It didn't change my decision to move on, but it gave me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Looking back, I've come to see this experience as both a tragedy and a turning point. It forced me to confront truths about myself, about trust, and about the fragility of the connections we build with others. But it also gave me the chance to rebuild, to learn, and to grow. And for that, I am grateful.
How was the video? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. Leave your thoughts in the comment below. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.